Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have author Jon Michaels with us today. We'll get to Jon in just a second, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or a post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Jon Michaels, he's a UCLA professor of law specializing in constitutional and national security law. His award-winning scholarship has appeared in the Yale Law Journal, University of Chicago Law Review, and Harvard Law Review, and he has written popular essays for the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, and Guardian. A Yale Law graduate and Supreme Court clerk, Jon is also a member of the American Law Institute and serves on the advisory board of UCLA's Safeguarding Democracy Project. His latest book, co-written with David Knoll, is Vigilante Nation: How State-Sponsored Terror Threatens Our Democracy. Jon, welcome into the back room.
Thanks for having me.
So congrats on the new book. It's called Vigilante Nation: How State-Sponsored Terror Threatens Our Democracy. Give us the overall gist of the book and why this subject is so important, especially now with 3 weeks away from the election.
So the goal in our book is to identify the different ways over the last several years that particularly red state governments have been targeting vulnerable groups, whether they be pregnant persons, LGBT kids, teachers who want to teach diverse and inclusive educational material, and people who want to rally and march and protest for causes that they believe in. And what we do is we've been seeing these different elements of these dynamics play out. And we've also heard different groups who cry foul when this happens. And we're drawing a big circle around all the groups and saying, hey, this is a unified, comprehensive agenda to not only deprive individuals and groups of their civil rights, but think about the political ramifications of pushing all these folks further into the margins of our society. And so we kind of take a spin off of the Adam Serwer, the cruelty is the point line that has gotten a lot of traction, understandably. And we say the cruelty isn't the point, it's the means to an end. And the means to the end is to suffocate multiracial democracy in America.
Maybe this is a kind of a dumb question, but is it coming more so from one side of the political spectrum?
To date, that's certainly the case. The history of political violence, and especially state-sponsored political violence in America, has been largely right-wing driven, and in part that reflects who we are. It reflects who has guns in America. It reflects who's always had power in America, and essentially which groups traditionally law enforcement has sided with. Because for us, it's the state-sponsored element of political violence that really gives it its most powerful force.
Mm-hmm. And we've witnessed a breakdown in the rule of law since Donald Trump emerged on the political scene. He's ushered in and leads a formalized violence movement for political gain. The Republican Party, they're not really the party of law and order anymore, are they?
No, it's quite dramatic when one thinks about what has happened to the modern Republican Party that was largely the manifestation of the kind of post-World War II era that believed in small government, promoted business interest, and was pretty internationalist when it comes to foreign affairs. And we're seeing an abandonment or an about face on all three of those dimensions in the last decade and 2 decades. There's different questions about where do you actually identify who is the trigger. Was it Newt Gingrich in the 90s? Was it the McCain decision when he was forced to take Sarah Palin as his vice president? At what moment did the party kind of start down this alternate path? But yeah, it's not the Republican Party of generations past.
So you do write in the book how state-sponsored vigilantism in the U.S. is not something new. What are some of its roots, and how has it heightened in the wake of January 6th?
Yeah, so I think, again, this is about like what happened in the modern time and what happened in the pre-modern time. In the modern time, we were just talking about the Republican Party. In the modern time, we associate vigilantism with activity outside of the law and in defiance of the law. It's taken on kind of a very strong popular cultural power with everyone from Charles Bronson in the 1970s with Death Wish to Jack Bauer on TV's 24, Kiefer Sutherland in the long-running series 24, when oftentimes he needed to go outside of the scope of the law and he would turn in his badge and he would go and do his own thing to get kind of free of the American legal bureaucracy. But if you go back further, vigilantism has been very closely tied to state support. And where we identify the kind of most jarring and tightest links is to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and then bring the kind of history of public and private partnerships to enforce first slavery itself and then white supremacist racial codes in the post-Civil War Jim Crow South. We identify how acts of Congress, acts of state legislatures, decisions by prosecutors whom to let off without prosecuting, and juries to decide who doesn't go to prison for private forms of terrorism against first people who ran away from slavery, and then after the Civil War, Black Americans who tried to exercise their franchise to vote, the white allies who supported what was then the kind of Reconstruction Republican government, which was in favor of engendering greater equality in the wake of the Civil War. And so for us, those touchstones are so powerful and so resonant. And it's also not shocking that most of the red state vigilantism today has its origins in what was the old Confederacy: Tennessee, Florida, Texas.
Mm-hmm. And those states, Texas, Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, they've enacted draconian vigilante laws encouraging citizens to attack other citizens. Are there other states considering such laws?
Yeah, so depending on the target, there could be anything from a few states to a dozen states. And so we see laws that are allowing or authorizing private actors to challenge, let's say, school districts that have gender-inclusive bathrooms, or allow transgender girls to play on their interscholastic athletic teams. There may be state bans. There may be state bans and private enforcement mechanisms, or they may just be private enforcement mechanisms. And what those specifically look like, because we haven't had a chance to get into the details, is that an individual who identifies or has reason to believe that this school is allowing, let's say, a trans kid to use the bathroom that matches their gender identity, they can sue the school district. And then you just they can sue the school district, and they may be able to receive monetary damages, so they have an incentive to do so as well. We see the same thing when it comes to books that teach divisive material, however you want to define that, and the vagueness itself raised constitutional problems. But what's resulted from that is a few dozen activists that have largely changed how school libraries look across half of America, because school districts don't want to go to litigation over this. They don't want to be embroiled, and they don't also want to be kind of plastered on Fox News and other kind of right-wing outlets, and then have their teachers be the subject of doxing or harassment of the sort. Then we go into spaces like Texas with SB 8, which was the private enforcement to sue doctors and other providers of reproductive rights. And that movement stayed powerful even after the Supreme Court reversed Roe v. Wade, because one question that arose after the Dobbs decision that effectively allowed the states to ban abortions as a matter of state policy is, why do you need private vigilantism after all, now that the state can do it themselves? And one reason is I think very powerful, which is immediately district attorneys and other government officials in blue states, like blue cities, I apologize, like Houston, like Austin, like El Paso and San Antonio, they quickly announced that they're not going to enforce state laws against pregnant persons or their doctors.
Yeah.
With something like SB8, the local prosecutor's decisions don't fully matter anymore because now someone from the reddest community within Texas can show up, identify an abortion that has happened, and bring suit and essentially shut down a clinic. So all the clinics in Texas have shut down, even though, the Houston DA and the Austin DA can say, "Don't worry, we're not gonna prosecute you." The fact that there's a private angle.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, Andy, for going on long. Let me just identify one more because it's
Sure.
another wrinkle to this. Is that in some states which already have pretty liberal gun laws, which already have stand your ground defense laws, which many think engender greater conflict and confrontation. There are in Oklahoma and Florida, there are laws that allow drivers to use their cars to as a potential weapon if the driver, has something like, quote, a reasonable concern that their safety or property is under threat. And so in Oklahoma, we saw I think it was in 2021, but I might have the date wrong. No, it must have been 2020, where a driver rammed a protester off a overpass, and the person was paralyzed, and life is completely altered from that. And in Florida, there's kind of chance when there was a Black Lives Matter protest that was lingering in an intersection, and the chant that the drivers were hearing was, "You can do it. Go ahead and ram them. DeSantis said it's okay." And so you can see also the even if it doesn't happen, even if someone doesn't use that type of power that's been given to them, the recognition that it's available could chill so much political activity that it serves the same purpose.
It's interesting. It seems like there's two distinct buckets of vigilante behavior. One that's more centered around legislation that you've been talking about, and which is rooted in just people's hate of other. And then there's the kind that comes from Donald Trump, which is more rooted in just authoritarian behavior and a shift towards authoritarian behavior. For example, recently when he said, if he's president again, there should be a day of violence and we'll just clean it all up. One day it'll be gone. Poof. I mean, that's like serious dictator shit. That's not like keep the trans kids out of the bathroom, Does that worry you more?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an escalation. It changes who's part of the conversation or who's the audience. The people who are doing the kind of retail level damage in towns, going into libraries, going into schools, standing on the sidelines of a soccer pitch and saying, "I think that kid's a boy," maybe just because they want to rattle the team or they feel like no one could be better than my daughter. It must be something else going on. My biological daughter, and I'm using scare quotes for the listeners. That I don't know if the call, the stop the steal like call, or a replay of go ahead, I will issue you a pardon if you storm the Capitol today or something like that. I don't know if it speaks to the same audience. The thing about January 6th that supports your point is that we saw a lot of kind of regular Americans. They weren't all people who were active militiamen who went to the Capitol and wreaked havoc. So we are getting a blurring of that line between those who essentially want to be authoritarians and are looking for opportunities to do so, and those who think they're staying within the four corners of the law and just are appreciating that the country is turning in a more what they would call conservative, I would say is reactionary fashion. So as more as that world blends, as the PTA moms blend with the right-wing militia groups, then the distinctions that we're drawing, these categories of different types of legal vigilantism, are also going to break down. So my answer is kind of a dodge, but I guess it's going to bleed into the two are going to bleed into one another.
So what is the January 7th Project and who's behind it?
Yeah, this is a great transition because this is, I think, what I'm trying to get at, which is there were many Republicans who were mortified by what happened on January 6th, including those in positions of significant power in the Senate, in the Justice Department, and at the state levels. And they weren't necessarily disinclined to support right-wing political power, but they didn't want it to look like a chaotic mess, which is what we saw on January 6th. And it seems that many of them decided, well, the lawsuits of December 2020 that were poorly constructed, that didn't get anyone anywhere, and that looked a lot like sour grapes. There are ways that we could set out, and obviously the January 6th attack, which looked like America at its nadir. There's ways that we could structure legal change that enable legitimate forms, if there's lack of a better word, of voter suppression, legitimate forms of intimidation that lead to fewer manifestations of progressive political progress. And so the folks who were found the idea of making America great again attractive, the folks that aren't necessarily wedded to democracy, but the folks that like to see things run a little bit cleaner, a little bit more orderly, and certainly more legitimately in their eyes, set out to create this legal regime where there could be essentially legal subordination of those who challenge essentially white Christian male authority in America. And that comes up in not just in all the ways that we've been talking about in terms of pure vigilantism, but also other forms of voter suppression, other forms of challenges that lead to election insecurity of the sort that this country really hasn't had. I know that people talk about election fraud, election security issues. They really don't exist for a system as federalized, as decentralized as ours is, and full of folks who clearly seem that they're willing to paint outside the lines. We've not had the type of voter fraud that could really derail a country of our size and diversity.
And so how does all of this connect to Project 2025? And what are your biggest concerns and fears over that?
So Project 2025 is the essentially the wish list, the governing manual, something in between for the next Republican administration. On one hand, it's the same type of document that the Heritage Foundation has put out every 4 years in the hope that a Republican wins the presidency and runs with ideas that the Heritage Foundation finds most important. What's different about it this year is there's no hiding the ball on what the agenda is. This is a much more radical, angry document that really wants to change the national government wholesale and use the national government to punish blue states and blue cities as well. So in many respects, again, it's all part of it. To me, it's all part of the same right-wing political movement that's not only at war with the American center-left, but also at war with the traditional Republican Party. It's trying to politicize the Justice Department to avoid going after those who tamper with elections and to prioritize going after, for instance, blue city prosecutors who refuse to prosecute those who are labeled Antifa or those who are supporting the sanctuary city policies with respect to immigration. It's using the education department funding to go after school districts that teach inclusive concepts or that do diversity. And it's also the other place that has a big kind of a health component to it. It's trying to create a kind of a national framework for targeting those seeking abortions, whether in a particular state or certainly going across state lines. So what we're seeing there is in one respect, if I really want to just be like my book's important, it's the nationalization of David Nolan, my book project. More perspective, it's again the fact that the Republican Party members and the right-wing organizations that are propping it up and serving as its kind of intellectual think tank is basically all converging on the same set of pretty thuggish types of public policy that is meant to demonize and subordinate those who aren't part of the favored cohort within America. And it's 900 pages. It's in some respects it's disorganized and chaotic because different individuals wrote different chapters, but it's still much more sophisticated and much more grounded than anything that the first Trump presidency had at its disposal. And I mention that, Andy, for a particular reason, that I don't think if Trump wins, it's going to be more of the same of 2017. It's going to be much more aggressively capable of enforcing a vision that was largely just kind of concepts that Trump would float into his head, and then he would be distracted by something else tomorrow. There's going to be too many of the folks who care about these issues more than anything else in the world who are going to be leading the federal agencies, and they're not going to lose track of what they want to accomplish this time.
Mm-hmm. So let's stick with that just for a second, because I don't think anyone would argue that January 6th was the worst example of vigilante behavior, at least in modern history. Trump is certainly operating from the same playbook. If I win, it's fair. If I lose, it's rigged. Do you fear another insurrection like January 6th, or are you more concerned about the lone wolf type of action?
Yeah, so I think I might say lone wolves. I think that in the next few months, which feel really scary to me, mm-hmm. I think that a concern is that a couple of individuals and take it upon themselves to do real damage at a major voting center in a blue city in a red state, whether that's on election day or whether that's on the next day when the tabulations count, or whether it is more of a march on a state capitol when it's time for the state legislature to certify the state results. And if we see anything more like what we saw in November of 2020 than on January 6th, but this time more organized and this time more violent, because they saw how far you can get by just threatening to kill people and banging on the glass. And in order to do something different, do they have to step up their game, as it were? And that to me is terrifying. Mm. One example of confirmation that others are terrified too is if your listeners would Google Maricopa County's election plans for November, and the photos that is on the CNN website has a good story on it. The Guardian has a good story on it. The pictures on there look like the voting center, the voting administration center looks like something you would see in the green zone of mm-hmm. Baghdad during the height of the American occupation in the 2000s and 2010s. It does not look like a government building of any sort that we would identify with the United States. And it's tragic, and though also commendable that if that's what they think they need to get us through this election, then I applaud their efforts.
Yeah, no, that lock and key kind of entry system that was implemented by who's the Secretary of State in Arizona?
Well, I think it's Governor Hobbs was doing this. I'm not sure.
Okay.
It might be the Secretary of State or it might be the county officials.
Yeah.
Maricopa County is very serious about what it's going to take to make sure that they don't have a repeat of 2020. Arizona was also the site of tremendous harassment of one of their leading Republican figures, Rusty Bowers, who was, I believe, the president of the state Senate at the time. He and his wife were caring for their mm-hmm. dying adult daughter who had cancer and who succumbed to cancer in early 2021. And there was a nonstop barrage of presumably former friends or allies of mm-hmm. his over the years who thought he was a traitor to America and made their life a living hell while their life was already, for family reasons, hellish.
That's the craziest thing, is that people like Rusty Bowers are the true patriots. The true patriots are the ones being accused of being traitors. And the traitor-in-chief is the one who is saving democracy for us. I mean, it is so upside down, the country that we're living in right now, when it comes to this stuff.
And if the Republicans don't realize that some of their leading lights have been drummed out of the party, and think it won't happen for them, they're dead wrong. How many waves of Republican purges have there been through the primaries every single cycle in the last
Well, just take
8
Arizona.
years?
Remember before the 2020 election,
Yeah.
it was like, oh my God,
Flake.
the election deniers are going to win from top to bottom, from governor down to and they all lost. It was they were summarily rejected by voters in basically every single election, and the state was flipped to Democrats. So,
well, that's one of the reasons it flipped, in part because they drummed out Jeff Flake and they drummed out the McCain family, and I think enough people in Arizona got the message in a way that some of our Republican elites don't see.
Mm-hmm.
But the voters have. And we're also seeing, and on the brighter note, we are seeing some of the harshest of the school board members who really want to go to war against kids. Some of them are starting to lose elections.
Mm-hmm.
We're also recognizing it's not a governing platform. It's a platform of chaos, but it's not a platform to govern. So once the right wing has gotten power, if they can't hold on to it through illicit means, they're probably not going to hold on to it for very long because people have common sense.
Mm-hmm. Talk about the 4 distinct vigilante strategies.
Yeah, so these have to do with the categories and techniques that we've identified, and some of them we've already covered, but I'll just put a name to them. Mm-hmm. So we talk about dissenter vigilantism, which has to do with individuals having the right to basically mess things up for everyone else, for lack of a more legalized term for it. But it's allowing where in the past we would accommodate dissenters, whether it's about material that they don't want their kids to touch in school or vaccines that they don't want their kids to have. We used to allow those people. We didn't force them. We didn't hold them down and stab them in the arm with a vaccine or make them, like in the Clockwork Orange, their eyeballs have to see certain material. They were essentially excused. They could go do their own thing, but they couldn't bring their agenda into the school districts. And what we're seeing now is a flip on that any one person who has an objection can essentially tank things for the whole community, even if that's a progressive community within a red state. So one family that's really angry about content doesn't just keep their kid home, they cancel the lesson for the school. And so that's one area we're really focusing on. And it's a very effective way for for blue communities within red states to feel that they can't cloister themselves away from the politics at the state capitol, that any one individual is going to come and ruin their little part of kind of blue paradise in the Sun Belt or wherever. The second category we've talked about a little is going to court, and we call it courthouse vigilantism, where there's changing kind of legal rights of action, where individuals who are offended by activity like someone else having an abortion suddenly have a claim to go to court and to sue the providers and make money off of it. And there's forms of courthouse vigilantism that not only are targeting the abortion providers, but as I've talked about, school districts that are accommodating trans kids and things like that. Next, we talk about street vigilantism, which are changes in the law and changes in prosecutorial decision-making that essentially enables and empowers and encourages thuggish behavior when it comes to political rallies, when it comes to events in the town like the drag queen story hour, the show of force of the sort that threatens and intimidates and essentially kills the opportunity for a civic space to be truly inclusive. And the legal regime that supports that effort is what we call street vigilantism. And fourth and finally, it's private individuals essentially having access to challenging voter registration, to change the way in which voters vote, and to change the way in which voting is counted behind the scenes. All private individuals empowered to do those things is our fourth category, which we call election vigilantism, which is the most important for the next month, of course, next 2 months going forward. And those are the general categories of activism. And you can see that different types of individuals might be more drawn to one or the other. They might be more drawn to the courtroom, keep their hands ostensibly clean. They might prefer the more visceral forms of conflict in the streets or at the voting centers.
You think this situation is going to get a lot worse before it gets a lot better?
I'm afraid to say I do. I think that if Kamala Harris wins, there's going to be a concerted effort to redouble and expand upon what's already on the book. In part because, and this is going to be a similar answer to if Trump went, but in part because some of what we saw in the years 2021 through 2024 were something of a competition among red state governors to get the biggest headlines on Fox News, to be the heir apparent in the MAGA coalition. And so Glenn Youngkin and Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott were often competing with one another to outdo each other. And in American federalism, we talk about races to the top, where states compete to show how virtuous they are, and races to the bottom, where states have incentives to get worse and worse and worse. What the red states would say, these are a race to the top. I would differ on that. But so I think we would see an intensification of that as there would be an audition for who's the true heir apparent to the kind of the vengeful, embittered president of a sort, a presidency of the sort that Donald Trump is promising. But I still think we'll see versions of this in were Trump to win. Maybe it become less important at the state level, but again, it's become very popular within a very small segment of an increasingly small Republican Party. And as the Republican Party becomes more and more distasteful to the median voter, there's a choice. The Republican Party could rethink its entire strategy and be more genial and more inclusive and more maybe candid about the mistakes they've made in the past, or they could double down. And the only reason to double down is if they think they can suppress enough votes, push out enough minority families. And so they change the electorate, and red state power stays the same. So I'm afraid in the short term, my prediction is more of the same regardless of what happens in November.
Yeah, Jon, I'm afraid I agree with you. I think it's going to get a lot crazier before it gets a lot better. Great conversation. Thanks for coming on. Good luck with the book, and we'll fingers crossed for November 5th.
Thank you so much, Andy.
All righty. Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Matty Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Lengyel. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.